As you introduce the leadership lever into the conversation that brings everything else together, I don't want to waste any time. I mean, there's so many things that, you're speaking of, and I have to make some notes myself that want to make sure that we cover. But I would also like to invite our distinguished panelists and our moderator to take that conversation into some depth. Let me introduce the moderator for this session. No stranger to conferences and to challenging the status quo. The moderator is the Executive Director of the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. We have Dr. Eduardo Ali. He has worked in 20 Caribbean countries in the Middle East, the US, and Canada, and has principally been in the education sector, in policy making, in quality assurance, strategy, and implementation for over 2 decades. So his biography is quite long, but Dr. Eduardo Ali is quite accomplished, and I think he has a lot to add in terms of leadership and interrogating what we need to do taking this forward. So I'd like to invite Dr. Ali to take the floor and to take the conversation further.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Good evening to all the distinguished panelists. And of course, good evening to all of the participants who are part of this forum. It is really my privilege and pleasure to have been invited to moderate this session on a topic of which I have tremendous interest, and that is the relationship between governance and leadership and risk. First of all, let me first start by saying that today we have distinguished Caribbean luminaries who are all part of the social partnership arena. We have members from academia, from business, and certainly from government at the highest levels. And so we are very privileged to have a discussion today involving these individuals who I am sure are going to illuminate our conversations and certainly take us in a strategic direction in terms of that conversation. I would like to start by introducing our distinguished panelists, and to begin by again introducing Minister Erm D. Lewis, who is the Minister of State with responsibility for the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, Management and Reconstruction in the Bahamas. As you've heard this morning, he's an architect by profession, he's a politician, he's an athlete, and certainly has been a leader in the NGO sector in the Bahamas. And we welcome you, Minister Lewis.
Thank you.
Second, we have, and you've heard him before, Mr. Anthony Subero, who's spoken on many occasions this morning and this afternoon. Mr. Subero is the Chief Operations and Compliance Officer for Hitachi Systems Security, Inc. He has been Chief Risk Officer of the Republic Financial Holdings, with over 30 years experience in the banking industry, and of course has been in consultancy and training and a range of areas. So we are again very happy to have him with us this afternoon.
Welcome, Mr. Subero. Thank you. Anthony,
thirdly,
please.
we have Mr. Ken Haksho, who everyone knows as the esteemed founder and president of the Caribbean-Risk Management Academy. He is a risk management consultant and expert. He has worked as an organizational change architect and risk management practitioner in Trinidad and Tobago, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. Welcome, Mr. Haksho.
Thank you, sir.
And of course, we have the only lady on the panel this afternoon, Ms. Kelly McFarlane, who's a clinical and organizational psychologist by profession, and she's also chief executive of a firm here in Trinidad and Tobago. She has a wide-ranging experience dealing with psychosocial issues, from counseling to training to treatment, and we are very happy to have her with us this afternoon.
Happy to be here.
Ms. McFarlane.
Thank you.
And by no means last or least is an esteemed academician, Dr. Wayne Charles Soverall, who is a senior lecturer in public health management at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill in Barbados. As I've told you, he's an academic, he's a researcher, a teacher extraordinaire, an NGO leader, and an advocate for effective public sector governance and management. by the work he's done in training and consultancies in the Caribbean region. So we're very happy to have him with us also. So again, good afternoon to all of you. I would just like to start by indicating that there are a number of themes that have come out of this conference from this morning to this afternoon, which I think connect very well and resonate very well for our discussions today. And I just want to point to some of these issues very briefly, because I think they're going to help us as we pontificate and as we assess and as we analyze and as we critique some of the issues associated with corporate governance and leadership. And the first theme that resonated very clearly for me from this morning has to do with favorability and credibility, which links to the issue of reputation, where they're talking about it from the academic levels to the governance levels to government to certainly business. There's also the issue of accountability and its relationship with corporate governance, that of sustainability and its relationship with technological capacity and operability, the issue of resilience and recovery systems and the impact that has on vulnerability, and the issue of chaos and how chaos is managed in times of crises, assets and hazard management, data analytics, compliance and security, quality management and assurance, strategy, results-based management, and planning, which includes not only risk-based planning, but scenario planning, contingency, and forecasting models. What all of these things seem to do, it shows a clear relationship between the issue of the role of champions in risk management and governance, to the role of sponsors, to the role of the enablers, whether they're providing for incentives or the championing and management and leadership of people in the system, to the use of technology and all the actions that organizations have to be engaged in as it relates to execution. And one of the points made by Mr. Henry in a previous conversation had to do with the issue of courage and the role that people play in building organizations of agility and accountability and that of transformation. And earlier on, to kickstart our session, Anthony spoke about having an awareness of technology and the ability to manage technology, the awareness by leaders of being able to have conversations around risk and the competence around risk, that of being aware and being efficient and effective in managing corporate governance, and of course looking at strategy and execution and data compliance within an ERM framework. Now, I just want to say that in the area of corporate governance, as was mentioned, if we look at it from the perspective of governments, or we look at it from this perspective of organizations, there is a relationship, and I'm sure we're going to hear different persons speaking on these issues, between corporate governance and public governance, and the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals, the World Economic Forum and its strategies for economic resilience, and of course the Global Competitive Index and what that means for business to be competitive. And there are several, in fact, in theory, there are 12 principles for effective corporate governance and public governance that shows the relationship between law, public policy, government, governance, and execution. So taking from all of that, I'd like to ask our panelists some questions this afternoon, because I believe that you all would have a lot to share in all of these aspects of our discussion. And I'd like to start with Mr. Subero, Anthony. And I know in your conversations earlier, you spoke about the importance of leadership and the dimensions of leadership and how they're all going to guide and the framework for organizations to be able to take them through everything from risk planning to risk execution. And you've looked at it within a COVID-19 context as well. So in your opinion, sir, do you believe that risk management models have become fully integrated in the Caribbean economies today, and with more specific attention to that of government? And if you believe that they have, could you please expand on it? And if you think they haven't, could you also expand on that for us?
So first again, Eduardo, is Anthony.
So I've been out of the Caribbean space because I'm based in Montreal. So I could speak to when I was back home in up to 2018. I had the good opportunity to sit on a state entity board. And just for transparency, Sport TT, but that was before all the issues. So I just want to, let you know that if I'm in transparency, I wasn't part of that process at all. But so the answer is no. I don't think so. In terms of what I've seen, I saw in one of the charts that they talk about the state enterprise performance and monitoring manual, the fact that risk management plays a key part in that. And I think it's exactly that. It's a manual. I always recalled I attended a World Bank conference, and there was this professor from MIT that was looking at the world and if the implications around the financial crisis. And I mean, he was a real brilliant man. But he started off his discussion or discourse by simply saying that no policy or process could effectively drive an organization or country to have effective risk management unless you have an effective culture and you have a solid leadership with unwavering integrity. Okay, and I want us to kind of marinate on that a little bit because I mean, we know it. I mean, Ken, you know it more than I. There's a lot of documentation and policies that exist within government. All right, but the fact of the matter is that there's no prevalence of the risk intelligence or the value of implementing specific models and how it could leverage the ability to achieve the objectives of that particular ministry. And I just want to challenge a little discussion here. I am not a firm believer that there is a huge disparity in terms of managing corporate governance as relates to private and public sector. Okay, yes, I do agree the objectives will be different. I do agree that there's a social value implication versus a share value implication. But I do believe that there are fundamental principles that could be applied to both if you have the strong leadership, all right, that can effect that change.
For thoughts, and I think you've touched on a very important point, and I love to hear the minister's response in terms of the issue of integrity in a moment. But I'd like to hear an academic's perspective on it as well. If I could call on Wayne to share his views on the issue.
Okay. So I think Anthony raised some good points. Whether we talk about public or private sector, we can find that it's not the fundamental difference is one of culture per se. I would say here because leadership. If we have leadership, strong leadership, effective leadership in the sector, public or private, it can go a long way to ensuring that you get the kind of accountability and so on. To take the point that Anthony raised about the manual, I mean, I teach public enterprise management, and I tell my students, let's go to TNT, which is where I'm from. I've been living in Barbados for the last 30 plus years. And I say, look at this, we have a manual. It lists all your state enterprises and what is supposed to happen in terms of corporate governance and so on. But as he said, it's a manual. Whether indeed there is practice which goes along with those manuals is another story. So, for example, the World Bank and the IMF said to our government here, 2018 when they came in, please review what's happening with your state enterprises. We have about 61 or 63 state enterprises here in Barbados. And good advice, good documents, good reports. So I always talk about theory and practice. Theory is brilliant. Practice is a whole different ballgame. And so I would argue that if we would have the leadership on the practical side, driving and being strategic and so on, it could make a difference. But we haven't seen that kind of leadership as yet. And so I would love to hear what the minister has to say from his vantage point.
We're going to hear in a moment. What I'd like to pick up on the point you made about, both of you made about the manual and the need for more than simply a manual. While the manual would have spoken to some principles for what one could refer to as effective corporate governance within state enterprises, there are many other types of state organizations or state-funded organizations that are not state enterprises, including ministries. And so the question one asked is, if there's a requirement for state enterprises to follow the guidelines of a performance monitoring manual, what equivalent is there for ministries to comply and to ensure that the ones who are leading these state enterprises are following what they're asking others to do? Have any thoughts about that, Wayne?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. And what should happen, again, if we separate out the theory and the practice, what should happen is that the ministry's mission, mandate, strategic direction should be the sort of guide as to what is going to happen. But I think there's a disconnect in that in a Caribbean context, we tend to do a lot of we have a lot of plans and so on, but then we don't tie them back to the budget and targets and outcomes. So if you look at the documents, they're there, they're all there. But then if we were to sort of link them now and say, okay, having said that, we have, let's take, for example, the Ministry of Tourism, which is a big ministry here in the driving force in Barbados. And we spend millions of dollars. Then let's say, okay, we are looking at BTMI or one of the marketing agencies to see whether there's congruence and whether there's a follow-up. What we find is that there are two types of cultures. So there's one for the ministry and there's one for the agency or the state enterprise. As a matter of fact, before we were restructured, there was a saying where the BTA back in the day was the rich cousin and the ministry was the poor cousin. So you had a situation where the ministry was more or less playing a backseat role and the BTA was the star, right? So we have those kinds of cultural shifts which can make it difficult to really align governance and sort of outcomes that you're taking. So for example, let me just give you one critical example. There was a time they were called that during that period, 94, 95 or so, the three wise men. And the BTA was doing something really innovative and strategic, a big risk in the sense that the three corporate leaders in terms of marketing, finance, and corporate strategy were taking the country in a particular direction. But here was the question people were asking. Why are these guys getting more money than the prime minister? Not looking at the risk that was being taken to take Barbados in a new direction. And so the questions of agility and taking risk and leadership were not clearly aligned with the thinking of mainstream public sector. And so you can have a disconnect there, which can really sometimes throw things off course. And then to get that alignment, I think you would need to have a lot more discussions among the leaders who may sometimes not see themselves as leaders. And that's another aspect that we can talk about as you go forward.
So I'm gradually building up the crescendo to get to the minister because I really love to hear what he has to say. But before we do, I'd love to hear Ken's take on it, being someone who has been involved in this arena for many years, looking at it from different angles in different countries. What is your view in terms of the models or the practices within government and that affect economies within the region? Do you think that they are prepared or ill-prepared? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I tend to agree, not tend to, I agree with what both Wayne and Anthony said. I make very little distinction between governance in the private sector and governance in the public sector. I would also align that or equate that to having the right people in both spaces. And I'll defer to my colleague Kelly to speak to the people element of it. But I have a very, it's not unique, because again, if I can refer to my friend Anthony there, we have some of the same concerns with what happens specifically in the public sector. From a risk management perspective, the private sector has much of what they need to have by way of risk and governance sort of in the right space. And government side, that performance manual, monitoring manual, again, one is outdated, as moved in a certain direction, has not been updated. That's one thing. And though it's a manual, it serves as a guideline, and not many of the entities follow those guidelines. It's referenced, but there's nothing. Many of what is referenced in there or articulated in the manual is not practiced. I love the idea, and Minister Lewis is here. What I think what needs to happen, there needs to be some legislation around that. There's conversations around certain aspects of risk management that is in one of different stages of legislation. But in Jamaica, for example, I know there's some specific legislation around enterprise risk management and governance that doesn't obtain in many of the other islands. So that let's set that aside. And so I have some real fears as to what needs to happen to basically put most of these government entities well,
I'm not sure if we're having a little connectivity issue.
Yeah, there's a little lag.
Yes. There's a little lag. All right. We'll come back to Ken and
the themselves on the state enterprises on a real task ahead of us. And so backing up a little bit, governance is to be there. Yeah.
Ken, we're having some
technical
difficulties with hearing you, particularly. There's some lags, but there are also some challenges in hearing you. But I think we got the gist of what you were saying. I think that there are certainly, comparatively, when you look at public sector and private sector, we can argue that corporate governance practices are essentially the same. There are subtle differences depending on the rules and the legislations that govern organizations and how they work. But of course, and the issue, of course, with respect to measuring performance in organizations, of which risk is a huge part. Clearly, the manual is outdated, and it needs to be updated. And of course, you need more than a manual. You need a system within which the manual is being implemented.
Yeah.
So we take that point. Now, what I'd love to hear the minister. We've been waiting on you, sir. To chime in at this point. Now, a lot of what is being said is that, as you've heard, their suggestions are, the theory is that public sector and private sector management practices, particularly as it relates to the governance, are essentially the same. We'd like to hear your thoughts on that from being a minister who works with a ministry and works with a government who also works with other governments from the CARICOM region. Do you mind sharing that perspective, Minister Lewis?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much to our host, our moderator, and to all of you for having me as a part of this panel. The sound was coming in and out, so I was not following all of the conversation completely. The question is...
So the question is, from your experience, the point was made is that the public sector and private sector corporate management governance practices are essentially the same. So we wanted to hear from you, being a minister of government who deals with public policy in your country, interacting with other countries. Do you see that there is a difference between what you consider to be governance in the public sector with governance in the private sector?
Yes, there certainly is a difference. Most of our state-owned enterprises is owned by the government. And from time to time, you may have persons playing political football. So a lot of times those organizations are overburdened, they are overloaded just for the sake of getting that vote and having that civil servant to support whomever is in government or whoever is vying for government. So a lot of the SOEs in the Bahamas, we find that they are more or less a burden right now to the country. And all of our SOEs comes under the Ministry of Finance. They're monitored by the Ministry of Finance. And we only, over the last 6 weeks, had a presentation by the Ministry of Finance. I'm talking about the viability, talking about the operations. And one of the things that I must say is that we must have the political will to enforce and to make sure that the manuals are more than just a manual, that they have teeth, that they have policy behind it. From the private sector is all about profit. If it's not profitable, they certainly will not bother with it. We need to. I'll speak from my ministry's perspective. We have legislated all of our policies. We have made there are two agencies within the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction, NEMA, which is quasi-government, and the DRA, which can operate as a private sector enterprise with very little government involvement. Because once you have political involvement, it's going to become overcrowded, it's going to become overloaded, it is not going to be profitable, and it's going to be a burden. Two of our major SOEs in the Bahamas, and I will tell you, is Bahamas Air. In 35 years, it has not been profitable. They have never made a profit, but we must still keep it going because it's a way of social engineering. It's a way, like I said, people play political football with it. The Water and Sewage Corporation, water is essential to life. We're not making money from those, but again, those SOEs are they are part of the burden that we are faced with, but we cannot get rid of them. From the private sector, the difference is the private sector is all about that profit. And if it is not profitable, they will cut it. In the government sector, we cannot, because a lot of our citizens really depend on those SOEs for survival. So there is a difference. How do we fix it? Remains to be seen. But again, unless we have the political will to do what is right, to cut when we have to cut, to make the adjustments when we have to make the adjustments, those SOEs will continue to be weight around the neck and they will drown the economy.
Okay, so you're saying basically that their fundamental difference has to do with will, and one is the will of the people versus the will of the bank. All right, so
absolutely, that's it. You hit the nail on the head. That's it. That's it.
Okay, and you made a very valid point in your presentation, and you said it a while ago. You mentioned that many of your public policies, if not all of them, have been legislated. And so obviously you see the value of legislation in terms of regulating a country's affairs.
Yes.
I'd like you to share with us your thoughts about the need for legislating risk management practices and systems at the country level. Because of course, for us, talking this through, we want to make sure that our ideas about how the role of legislation plays and its interface with governance and leadership in supporting good governance at a country level is something that is done, but systems are infused and interwoven through the entire system. So again, the question is, could you share with us what your thoughts are about your legislations, national legislations, and the impact those have on regulating risk management systems in a country? Do you think it's valuable, it's not valuable, and why?
It is absolutely valuable because having a playbook having a playbook just for the sake of having the playbook doesn't make any sense. But once it is legislated, legislation gives it teeth. You have an action plan, but because of the fact now that it is law, and those persons with responsibility to carrying out those laws, they are mandated to carrying out those laws as is legislated. Without the legislation, you can have it there. You can have wishful thinking. It comes and goes, and it's like it's just a playbook. It's only a picture. But once you have legislation behind it, you have action plan, and of course, those persons with responsibility for the legislation or for carrying out those orders, they now have to account. They have to come back. They have to give report. They have to now account to the people. They have to. And from the political perspective, as a politician, I must ensure that they carry their duties because I'm mandated to report to the nation on a regular basis as to what they're doing as mandated by law. So at the end of the day, I carry responsibility by being able to report to the nation. But by legislation, once they are tasked with their assignment, they are mandated to carry it out. So without legislation, having that playbook makes absolutely no sense. You must give it teeth, and the only way to get teeth is by having it made into law.
And of course, there's all the checks and balances in that whole system between the parliament and the cabinet and the line ministries responsible and the state enterprises and all of those parts of the system, Absolutely. The whole governance machinery. And so all of them, in your view, play a very important part from the planning to the execution, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we did, recognizing what happens when you have state-owned enterprise and you have a lot of political interference, we have let me use the Disaster Reconstruction Authority as an example. It is operated by a board of directors, no politicians. I don't even go to their meetings. There's a managing director, and they operate specifically from the private sector. They have the ability to go there and raise funds. They can distribute funds. They can make enforce the construction of roads, close roadways, turn utilities on without having to go to Parliament to get it done. They already have the power to do that. So all of the bureaucratic layers have been removed. You gave them all the responsibilities and all of the power to operate without political interference. We understand that we cannot take on the same model as is in the state-owned enterprise system, where it's political football. That is the norm. The politicians are taken out completely. We have professionals from the private sector, professional engineers, architects, bankers, doctors, lawyers. They are the ones running the DRA.
So Wayne, from a researcher's perspective, looking at these issues in the region and hearing what the minister is saying in terms of the relevance and role and impact of legislation, do you have any comments you'd like to share?
Well, I think this is new and this is unique in this sense. And so to have the boards with a certain amount of professional flexibility is good. The point that the minister made about reducing or minimizing the political interference is very key. Just 3 days ago here in one of our editorials, I can read for you just this as the headline. It says, appoint apolitical boards, making reference to the same thing that the minister is just saying there, that our practice in the Caribbean context has been that we have allowed the politics to interfere with the functioning of the boards, so that instead of being professional and being strategic and providing the kind of leadership that Anthony was talking about, they are sort of hamstrung because of the political culture which pervades the boards. And so they are not as nimble, they're more risk averse because they are just, nobody's going to hold into account. So the point that the minister is making there is a very valid point. It would be good to see more of this across the board, but we will be hard pressed to find examples like this. They're very few and far and in between. That's my experience of the boards across the public sector domain in a Caribbean context. So I think this is a new approach, a bit of fresh air, if we could say so, and we'll have to wait and see if they're allowed to really have a full reign, to run their course without being hamstrung in any way or fashion. But it certainly is a good start, because you need that leadership to bring the professional mindset to making decisions. And this is what risk governance and risk management and risk leadership is all about. So it's very good that, and perhaps because it is a new ministry and a new dispensation. So this is what I think Anthony started off by saying we need new leadership, and perhaps this is one of the examples of this new kind of leadership that we need, and we certainly need it. Well, that's my sense of what's going on right now.
You certainly have a subject there for research, which I think you should look into, because
most definitely I will be following it.
Practices may very well be emerging. Those things have to be shared and written in the literature.
Correct.
And certainly we'd like to see it published somewhere, and of course not just published, but of course the best practices shared where possible in fora, including at the level of CARICOM. So I think persons like yourself would be useful. But I think the minister also wanted to add to something before I get Ken's view on it. Minister, did you want to say something else?
Wayne touched on some very important point, building on what I said. And one of the words that he used was hamstrung. A lot of times these boards can be very effective, but they are hamstrung by politicians. After the board was established and went into full gear, some of my colleagues said, "Minister, you are hamstrung by this board." He said, "You are hamstrung because the board has all the power." I said, "That's the way it should be.
Right.
That's the way I want it to be, because of course the minister is temporary. We come and go, but the board should have the power." So I prefer the minister to be hamstrung and for the board to be empowered than for the board to be hamstrung because of political interference.
Okay, some thoughts about disruptive leadership. Ken, your views, please.
Yeah, I'm in full support of this. For a matter of fact, I think that should be written into law, because I think we can all speak of situations where the boards of state enterprises just ran rampant, and let's not call it boards. Let's use the words that apply. The individuals on the board, because board is it's not human. It's just an object. It's an inanimate. So it's the people on the board that are doing this. And if I may, Eduardo, let me just pull away a moderator, and I want to ask Ms. McFarlane to interject here, because if we are saying that the construct of boards, the people on the boards are the ones who are making decisions, what is it about these individuals that are causing us to want to have boards separated from politicians? What needs to happen by way of selection of the people on those boards? Because again, just saying board, it's actually the decision makers, the boards themselves.
Sure. So I think the first thing that popped into my head when you started asking that question is personality. And there's an interesting book called Sociopath in the Boardroom. And there's a lot of philosophy and idea in psychology that power attracts particular personalities. Not that everybody in power has the personalities, but we do have to be aware that there's an element of, a powerful position that attracts a particular personality, and also could take a good personality and corrupt it a bit, right? So we have things like hubris and narcissism and all of these things that come into play. So you asked what do we need to look at when we're appointing people to boards and people who are the decision makers. I would say we should look at 3 core concepts just to start. Yes, we want our people, well, one is task competency. So we want to know that you appoint somebody who is able to carry out the task, who is able to fulfill the mandate efficiently and effectively. Somebody or somebody's, right? Because you're talking about members of a board, and they are all in a sense leaders on that board. But you also want people with vision. And Anthony made that point earlier when we started the segment, and I wrote it down, and he said, you know, people are at the center, and people drive your vision. So the government or governors could set forth a mandate, and maybe even the vision, but the leaders, the people that we appoint, are the ones who have to say, okay, this is the way we get that done, right? And we want them to get that done effectively. So that's task, competency, vision, and they also need to be good with people. Being able to connect with people and understand what people will respond to, because essentially you have a vision, you have a task, you have a mandate, you have an idea, you have something you want to do, but you kind of have to know how to get buy-in from either the people on the team, the people within the nation, because again, the point was raised just now as well that we want to get votes. So next term we want to get votes. So it's important to understand what gets through to people, you know, what affects people. And a lot of times what affects people and gets through to people is what they see in you, the board member, the leader, the person who is setting, who is supposed to be protecting and creating things to take care of the citizenry. So I think I'll just stop there with the question, so I wouldn't run on. But basically, we want to look at some of those things.
I want to thank you for that. In fact, I was getting to you next, and that was one of the sub questions I had. But you've really taken us in a direction earlier that really has helped us tremendously. Because it obviously there's a link between legislation and public policy and leadership, and people connect all of those elements, whether they are political leaders, they are people on boards, they are people in enterprises, or the members of the public. And you spoke about the issue of competence, and I that a little bit more, because in your discussion you spoke to tasks. And task competence challenges that sometimes people face when they are appointed on boards.
Yeah, he's going in and out.
Is anybody? Oh, that was me. Okay.
Yeah, he's going in and out.
Yeah, Eduardo, are you there?
There's a little lag.
Yeah, Kelly, why don't you pick up on that point though? I mean, how?
Point, yeah.
Well, yeah. So if I'm to interpret part of the question that he asked, so leadership is you must bring certain competencies with you if you want to be an effective leader. Yes.
Yes.
And related to personality, heuristics. Can you expand on that part a bit? So are there good heuristics and bad heuristics? What part, you know, what does data or research show? And Anthony, you may want to jump in there, because we have had some conversations about that. What are the bad parts of leadership by way of biases that will make an institution fail, that will cause an institution to fail? What aspects of leadership will aid in that failure?
Okay, so should I go first or Anthony?
Yeah, no, go ahead,
Yes.
Kelly. Please.
Okay, so let me take it a layer above first, right? In the first place, making somebody a leader or giving somebody a particular leadership position. A lot of times what organizations do is they appoint people simply because they've been with us for many years, or they appoint people because they do a particular task quite well, right? A particular task. But again, this is where vision comes in, because I can be like a computer. If you took a linear approach and you just said, this person has been with us for 25 years, 30 years, they do the thing that they do really well, so definitely let's put them into this position. And we take that linear approach and we don't look for the other aspects that I mentioned, like vision and people skills, emotional intelligence and stuff like that, and their own personality. What could happen is that person could become quite burnt out, because I would venture to think that somebody who is in an organization and enjoys their job and enjoys the things that they do, want to do a good job. but they may not understand why they're not getting the response from their people. So Ronald Reagan had a really interesting quote that I always liked, and he said, a leader is not somebody who does great things. He or she is somebody who gets people to do great things. And getting people to do anything is not necessarily an easy task, right? So some of the research around, let's say, bad leadership, I think that's what you asked, what might a leader do that might demotivate their followers. Actually, before I say that, what is a good way to test somebody for a leadership position or to observe how somebody might fit into a leadership position is to monitor them under stress. And that goes for every aspect of life. When we are under stress, our brains and our bodies react in a very specific way. And that way shows us our core limitations in terms of how we deal with people, how we handle tasks, and how we manage our own emotions and regulate our own emotions. And when you talk about crisis, you're talking about two main things you need. You're talking about emotions and you're talking about cognition. And both of them don't work very well together. Right? I want to get scientific and talk about the prefrontal cortex and stuff, but I won't, right? Unless you want to hear it. Right? So those two things. And I think when we talk about risk management and we talk about crisis management and looking forward to protecting an organization in times of crisis and in a sense of risk management, we want to look at how people do respond in very stressful situations. Are they still able to make the decisions? Do they create a stress contagion? So I'm in a leadership position. I feel very stressed and I stress everybody else out and nobody is able to function, right? So some of these things are some of the things we really need to look for. Yes, Ken, I see you're going to say something.
Yeah, so before Anthony jumps in, so how do you, and it's kind of like a nice segue into discussing, I want to call it a tool, but an assessment we are working on to offer some guidance in that regard. But how do you then identify those traits or deficiencies in leaders or potential leaders before you give them a board appointment or you appoint them a minister or a chief compliance officer?
First of all, let's be objective and honest. We need to be objective. Many times, again, we do not want to what's the word to use? Hurt or insult our leaders or our talent that have been with us for a very long time. But what we do want to start, how we want to start thinking about it, so we feel comfortable with it, is that we want to ensure that we support our leaders properly. So you may be great at tasks, not so great at people, but we can train that, right? So we get the best out of you and the best out of them. So how do we do it? We assess. So we can use 360 assessments where we have your colleagues assessing you, the staff assessing you, the management assessing you. We can bring in an outside party to do some of these assessments so that it's not on the company that the company is having an issue with you, but we've brought in the professionals in the area of whatever, of risk management, of leadership, and so on. And this is what has been found, and this is where we can support you being ready for this particular this particular mandate with this particular culture and mission and vision that this organization has. So you wouldn't take a leader in TTPS and a leader in, let's say, a psychology firm or somewhere, they will have different requirements. And if you take the same requirements for both organizations, both firms, it won't necessarily work, right? So sometimes we do need to sort of specialize it, So, yeah.
Anthony?
A lot of food for thought, Kelly. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
I mean, I have a different perspective. I believe there's the skill, the technical competence that you will need based on the environment, the type of organization to which you have leaders. But I think there are values that should be unwavering in terms of leadership. And that's why I'm really strong around
Anthony
this.
is true.
Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me, guys?
Yeah,
I'm hearing you. Yeah.
All right.
We're hearing you. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, and I keep using the words ethics, and I don't want to sound like a romance type of guy, but I am a firm believer in that, in relation, in that, you know, a leader need to have prudence, a leader need to have equitable assessments, a leader need to be fair. Yes, you have to make, you know, major decisions, but the decisions you make has to be transparent. You know, the words I like to use is visibility and credibility. You know, I believe in the context of servant leadership, and I really want to applaud Minister Lewis for the approach that he's taking. I have interacted, Ken, you know that a lot of ministers is about power. Right? So I'm in charge of a state enterprise. It's more about power. Okay. Yeah. And it comes back to, you know, I remember a particular article I was reading where a gentleman walked into his psychiatrist and you know, person said, David, you seem to have a hard day. And he said, well, yeah, I just lost my job. This is my 5th job I've lost in 7 years. By tomorrow, I think my divorce will be finalized, and this is my 3rd divorce. And I have no friends. And one of the reasons I came in here is to have a discussion how to deal with difficult people. So all right, and it comes back to that cognitive bias. Insight. You know, leaders need to understand. And again, I really need to sing Minister Lewis' praise. Is that you have to step back and understand what is the greater good you're trying to achieve. All right, and sometimes you don't need to have the power. You have the responsibility, because he has to be held accountable to the population and by extension the government. That is the kind of leadership shift you need to have. The other dynamics, and I want to get specifically to the government boards, and Dr. Sorbel said it nicely. Across the government, a lot of boards are basically political appointments. It's driven by people who follow the party, and not necessarily the best person to be placed on the board. And I mean, Ken, you know that? I sat on a board of Sport TT, you had about 7 sportsmen. I mean, if you wanted to kick a small goal at the back of the car park, it would have been great. But if it is you wanna run governance, you wanna run a state entity, there's a particular competence that you need to have. And the last point I wanna make in that is do we assess the risk predisposition of board members? No. Based on the mandates of that particular entity? Because you can have a combination of board members that are primarily risk adverse, all right? And you need to have that fair balance. I mean, one of the things we do as a company is when, like just recently, not recently, a year ago, we hired our CFO. And the way our company is structured, the CFO is a board member. And we had 2 really good prime candidates. I mean, really good. But one of them was extremely compliance-based, and he believed on the letter of the law, and this is how it has to be. And the other one was more balanced around risk and understanding a risk-based approach. How do you drive the business? All right, and what are the particular fundamentals you had to honor? But also, we also knew the composition of our existing board and how this person would complement that board. All right. So I think in terms of leadership, I think there are values that are unchangeable. It stands the test of time. I will even argue the difference between effective leadership and ethical leadership. I hate to bring this up, but I always say that Trump got 72 million votes, right? So yeah, you know, he is effective. All right.
Thank you, Ken, for filling in for me when I got disconnected. There was a technology glitch, but I've been able to resolve it, fortunately. And thank you, Anthony and Kelly, for sharing. There was a point that Anthony, you just made that I was about to ask Kelly about, and that had to do with the issue of corporate governance and the selection of people based on past competence. Because at the end of the day, persons who are placed on a state enterprise board or some form of corporate governance in an organization are persons who have to understand execution and understand operations and also understand strategy and policy. And so if you have, and you made the point a moment ago, Anthony, about persons who were on your board who were obviously from one particular background, not having that mix of experience at different levels to understand how a governance framework in an organization interfaces with the leadership and management frameworks and systems upon which strategy is important, and the need for ensuring that there's a separation, clear separation of authority between the executive and the board in relation to who does what, then obviously you will have problems. And how does risk play out in all of that? And to you, Anthony, how do you see that whole system between a board and the competence of a board and the competence of the executive and risk playing out in organizations?
Well, it comes back again, Eduardo, in terms of governance, right?
Yeah.
You know, I'm a firm believer in that there's a clear definition, and particularly let's talk about the state enterprise and those entities that were created. There's a reason they were created. They were created because of the level of bureaucracy that existed in the ministries, so that these state entities would have had the level of agility to execute the strategies, right? But when you have ministers getting heavily involved, or you have a situation where there's a cross between what the minister is doing in relation to the governance and decision making, and then you have some situations, and let's be fair, you have situations where you have chairpersons operating as though they're the executive chairmen, all right, where they're driving the discussion in direction at a level where the CEO has to follow a particular context. So I think corporate governance play a key part in that. But linked to that as well is within your enterprise risk management framework, and how do you drive particular evaluations and context within your ERM framework in terms of how effective your governance is. You know, that's one of the things that when I roll out enterprise risk management for Republic Bank, that was I think was fairly mature at the time, is also how effective is your board.
Right.
All right. And I must say that at the time, the group counsel, Jackie Commoner, I need to tell her that because she was my boss at the time, gave a lot of support around that discussion. All right. And that is another dynamic you have to play within an enterprise risk management framework. How effective is your board in decision-making process? How is your board in relation to compliance in terms of regulations? How is your board in terms of strategy and strategic direction and evaluation? Those are key things you need to evaluate within the RM process.
You also raised the issue of servant leadership and ethical leadership. And I want to get Kelly's view on this because Kelly, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. That same question you asked Anthony, we have just been joined by Dr. Karen Hardy. I would like you to put the same question to Dr. Hardy so we could get her view.
Yes, sure. Dr. Hardy, it's good to have you back. And for the sake of our listening and viewing audience, Dr. Karen Hardy is the CEO and Chief Risk Officer for Strategic Leadership LLC. She is an industry pioneer and she's an ERM specialist. And we were very happy to have her here today with us again for a second time. Dr. Hardy, Karen, we really like to hear from you in terms of your thoughts about the issue of the relationship between boards and the executive and the role that risk plays in terms of that whole interface. Who is responsible for planning risk? Who is responsible for ensuring risk is governed? And what is the relationship between the board and the executive in planning and execution of risk in a whole ERP context?
So I want to thank everybody for the invitation, and I'm so happy to join this afternoon for this very important discussion. I mean, it's a question that comes up all the time in terms of who's in charge, and who's on first and who's on second, in relationship between boards, and then those on the first line actually do the analysis and the work of risk. So in government, I'm coming from a government lens. Okay, and in some government agencies, you do have boards, like the Security and Exchange Division. But for the majority of the agencies that I deal with in public sector, they don't have boards. But they have bodies and governing bodies that act like boards. Okay, so they're more like councils. More like councils of leaders who represent the varying, functions within an organization. So what you usually have is you have a secretary of an agency who could be seen as the CEO. Then you have the deputy secretary of an agency who's considered the COO. So, we borrow those terms within government. And then you have all those other people that work for them. You have the CFO, we don't usually see people. That CIO, the CFO, the Chief Human Capital Officer, the performance, all these C-suite acronyms, right? So the question comes to the relationship and who's responsible. Let's start with the old cliche. It starts at the top. It's all at the top. I've seen it. Yeah.
So we're having a little difficulty hearing you, but if I'm hearing you correctly, I think there are two things that you said that I think we need to take into consideration. So maybe you want to check your audio settings or check your technology, your connectivity. But basically, I think the point that she made is that there's an issue of who is in charge of the organization and the role that that person plays. And it depends on what you're responsible for. But she also talked about the interface between the board and the executive. For example, the role of a corporate secretary or someone at that level who could manage those relationships and ensure that the guidelines and the systems are in place to effectively administer effective corporate governance systems. And I want to go back to Kelly. And Kelly, one of the things that we were talking about a while ago in terms of leadership and the dimensions of leadership, and those conversations came out very clearly from Anthony when he was reflecting on Minister Iram Lewis's conversations, has to do with the role of leadership. And there are different types of leadership, different dimensions of leadership. You have the point that Anthony made us. You can have ethical leadership displayed, servant leadership. There's disruptive leadership we heard this morning, transformational leadership in organizations, transactional. It all depends on what you want to do in terms of accomplishing your goals and objectives and strategy in your organization. I would like you to share with us, what do you think how do you see the different styles of leadership playing out in relation to those people who you think are going to be beneficial or important rather in administering an effective risk management system? Is Kelly there?
You're muted, Kelly.
Oh.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, how it plays out. Okay, it plays out, I think most, what stands out the most is how, remember, so let's first define leadership. So the leader has to be the person who executes a particular vision, but gets other people to share that vision and want to execute that vision in the way that he or she has planned it out, expects, right? So the leader now has to be somebody who is able to influence and persuade, in a good way, motivate people to want to do for the organization what needs to be done. So you mentioned transformational leadership, and that's kind of like a bit of a coaching style. And in many, but not all situations, transformational leadership is actually known, research says is the best type of leadership to get people really motivated and getting things done. Could you just, I think I derailed a bit. Could you come
so
back
I was
to
talking about transformational and transactional, the different styles.
Right.
If ethical, Anthony spoke about ethical and servant leadership, and disruptive, we heard this morning, all the various aspects to and styles of leadership and how those can play out in a risk management system.
Right, okay, good. So differently for different sectors. So for instance, transformational is the leadership style of preference for, let's say, most corporate and government agencies, But let's say for the military, you wouldn't necessarily have an ideal of a transformational type of leadership. Something a little more autocratic is definitely necessary. So in terms of one size fits all, we won't do a one size fits all in terms of leadership necessary. So it is important to understand the culture that an organization wants to have, to understand the vision and the mission, and then fit the leadership style that would best work to see that through. And those things, that's customizable in a sense.
Good, thank you very much. I have a last question to ask, and that question is for Karen Hardy, Dr. Hardy. I know she came in a bit late. I'm hoping she's been able to resolve her technology issues because we're coming to the end of this segment. So the question is, you spoke this morning a lot about the success of ERM and how it has been adopted and all of that. And I just wondered if you had any recommendations for, you looked at it within your context, in a federal context and so on in the United States, whether you had any recommendations for us people in the, she's not there, she left?
No, Eduardo, she's in the waiting room. You need to the host need to let her in.
Oh, well, I'm not the host.
Whoever the host, let her in.
She's back now.
Okay. She's back. Okay, I hope she's hearing me.
Hold on, she's now coming in now.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, Karen, are you hearing me?
Yes, loud and clear. I had to.
I'm hearing you much better than before.
I had to manage my risk there. Technology.
So did I. We were just saying, sorry, we were just saying we're running out of time and we're the last segment, and because you came in at the last bit, we have to hear from you. Your presentation this morning, you reflected on ERM and of course within a federal context within the United States, and you gave us a lot of food for thought. And I just wondered whether you had any recommendations for economies in transition, such as ours in the Caribbean, and some of the things, the takeaways you think that from your presentation this morning, you could share with us so that we could learn from in terms of establishing ERM practices and models in the Caribbean as economies in transition.
You know, as great as ERM sounds, the bottom line is that if you don't have buy-in, it's going to be very difficult to do. Amen. I mean, after looking at this over 15 years, it's promising. It is promising, but you have to have champions. You have to have someone really advocating for it, and someone who's the continuity of that leadership behind it is very important too. So many times I've seen people come in and out. They don't stick around long enough to go through a full cycle of implementation, and that can really be a detriment to the entire work being done to actually adopt that within the Caribbean. It's going to take a lot of people. It's going to take a lot of collaboration. But bottom line is that there has to be a sense of true conviction and commitment to actually seeing this through. It's like once you get started, you just can't jump off the bandwagon. You have to see it through, and you have to have committed leadership who not only have the affluence and influence and circle of influence, but also the resources to actually, resource out this function and to be able to sustain it over time. I wouldn't want to see it to be a short-lived effort because right. it takes a lot of effort. But if there's a long-term vision in terms of what do you want it to do, what is it that adopting ERM provides that's not being done now, that really gets to the gap analysis piece. What changes as a result of it, not because everyone else is doing it, not because it's popular, but because this is truly something that can transition how we work within our community, within our industry, and actually put us on the other side of this, in terms of better success, better performance, better achievement, faster achievement, all of those things. What happens as a result of having this? One of the things I did bring up in the presentation is the thing about value. And, what's the value of ERM? I mean, it's always a recurring question. Over time, I used to think that I had to define what that was for someone else. But the truth is, you can't. It's a battle you can't win because you can't tell people what they value. You can't tell an organization what's valuable to them. But if you can position ERM so that once you define what the organization already values, you know, you can pretty much follow the breadcrumbs in terms of what that is through their strategic plan, all those things, then ERM is used to protect the value of those things.
Right.
I think you're in a better position to sell enterprise risk management if you come from that perspective, rather than trying to convince someone that it's valuable to them. Organizations already have their value systems. ERM can help protect whatever that value system is. I think that's very important too. Go ahead.
I think you made that point very clear this morning about the confidence issue and the favorability and credibility issues in relation to an ERM model. And I really want to thank you for, again, sharing with us this evening. I know you came a bit late because of other challenges you had, but we were able to get you in and get your valuable contributions. And I really want to thank you for that. And I want to thank all of our esteemed panelists this afternoon, who coming from a wide range of backgrounds. I mean, we have had a minister of government, we've had practitioners in the field, we've had organizational and psychologists, we've had an academician, we've had a range of people who brought a lot of different perspectives to help us understand this whole the complexity between corporate governance, public governance too, and leadership, and what are the implications there are for putting in place risk management systems, and more specifically looking at how those things are to be implemented and the challenges therein. And I really want to thank you all for sharing. I think we've had a lot of stimulating discussion, a lot of new insights. We've also heard about best practice emerging in the Bahamas, which I think Wayne said he's going to do some research on, right, Wayne? So we are hoping for a lot of good things to come out of this. And we think that with the leaders in the right place in the region, and I think we have a lot of good people who are in a lot of good positions to influence the kind of change we need, and more specifically dealing with the disruption that we need to have. So as was said many times throughout this conference, and certainly today, you need courageous people, you need persons who will certainly realize that they have to depoliticize and apoliticize the systems and the processes. You need to be able to put the right models and practices in place, the indices, the indicators for success. You need to have the resources that kept coming through. And you, of course, need to have the competence of people who are there and the talent to be able to guide and implement these systems that you put in place. And so from a leadership perspective, I think as leaders, we've all been challenged this evening, as I certainly have been, to take this forward, because, you know, in my whole line of work, I don't only deal with one organization, I represent a sector of institutions within the country. And so I am also working with those to see what we can do. And we have also been looking at risk compliance models for our standards for accreditation. And I have been benchmarking with what's happening in the Far East. And certainly I've developed my own models in the past, which I'm going to be applying. And this conversation today has certainly been one of benefit to me. And I want to thank all of you, and certainly to the organizers of this conference, for hosting this very important conference, and certainly this very important session. And I hand you over back to Natasha for her conclusions.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. It's, as you said, it's been definitely a day full of learning, encouragement, the examples, the new standards being set, the pioneering work that's being done. There have been several references made to case studies and more research. When I was speaking earlier in the day, I mentioned that this is the vision of the Caribbean Risk Management Academy. We want to stimulate not just communities of practice, but research within the region and new knowledge creation within the region. And I may have also mentioned earlier that one of the things that we will be doing is launching the Caribbean Journal of Risk Management. So just from today's conversation, I can see that we have rich material going forward for both our next conference, as well as the first issue of the Caribbean Journal of Risk Management. So I think we are all definitely encouraged, absolutely excited, not just because of the contributions today, the learning today, but also the rich possibilities that are arising for us as organizations, for the region, for the collaborations, for the knowledge that will be gained, and for the sharing. And back to something Dr. Hardy said, risk management is really about delivering results as well and protecting value. So this is not just about talking about things that sound nice and ticking all the boxes in performance reviews, but really delivering and protecting value. So in the end, the ROI is there. Risk management is not an option. It is definitely something that needs to be done, but needs to be done well. It needs to be done with the right mindset, while being aware of all of the potential pitfalls, because all change is risky. All transformation involves risk, and the risk of failure, which came up again during the strategy session. We can't be afraid of failure. What we need to be afraid of is standing still and becoming irrelevant in the blink of an eye. So let us embrace it. Let us run with it and look forward to seeing what we are truly capable of. And as I put that together, I want to invite our president, Ken Haksho, to make some closing remarks and close off the day. Thank you to all of the many contributors and the participants who've been viewing and asking questions and making comments.